You're listening to Talk to Brazil with Tom Reaoch. Welcome to Talk to Brazil, the world's first English language internet radio program about business in Brazil, and now in podcast format. I'm Tom Reaoch and your host for the show. I'm talking from the city of Campinas in the state of Sâo Paulo, Brazil, so when you talk to Tom, you talk to Brazil and the world. Today's guest is Mike Adams. Mike is the best-selling author of 7 Stories Every Salesperson Must Tell. He's an engineer turned salesman, and Mike Adams taught himself storytelling on the job while selling and managing sales teams in the United Kingdom, Russia, India, China, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Australia for several international corporations. Since 2014, Mike has been helping companies find and develop their own stories through his storytelling consulting practice. And for our audience, Mike and I met a couple of weeks ago when I came across an article of his on LinkedIn about the secret of sales storytelling. Mike is married with 3 sons and lives in Melbourne, Australia, where he is talking with us today. So with that, Mike, hello and welcome to Talk to Brazil.
Hello, Tom, and hello, Brazil. I'm absolutely delighted to be talking with your listeners in Brazil, one of my favorite countries.
Well, I think it's one of everybody. Once a person who's been here, it becomes a favorite, right?
It was a long time ago that I was there. I was in Bolivia, Brazil, and Peru. More nearly 30 years ago, but I had a fantastic time.
Well, good memories, I take, right?
Fantastic memories, absolutely fantastic. And I didn't stay in São Paulo, but I do remember flying from Rio to São Paulo and flying for like what seemed like 45 minutes over that city, which is just enormous.
Well, it really is, right? From one side to the other is about 100 kilometers, actually.
So, yeah, exactly. I couldn't believe it.
Get that long. I mean, well, even today it's larger than that. But good that you have a feel of what the size of the country. Well, you come from a country that's big as well, right?
Yeah, that's right. Australia's pretty big. Yeah, and you've got rainforest and mountains, and we've just got desert in the middle of our country. Anyway,
but a lot of space, right?
Plenty of space.
And that's one of the things I found in my business out in the world, and you've been to many different countries, size is relative. I remember one of the times going to Holland or Denmark, and they would think something was far. Far for them was like 20 kilometers. And so it really depends where you are of what big or far or distance is, right? So
yes.
And I guess you've seen that quite a bit, huh?
Exactly. I worked in Russia, and I think we had 11 or 12 time zones from one end of the country to the other. So, yeah, that's bigger.
Well, so that's one of my challenges in podcasting is not only finding the people, but lining up time zones, right? Because for our audience right now, we're with 8 o'clock in the morning in São Paulo, Brazil, and it's 9 p.m. in Australia. And that's what the world's round and keeps going. That's the way it is. And I'm always fascinated when I speak to people on your side of the world that you live the future, our future. I'm waking up to a day that you've already seen.
That's right. We're ahead of you guys.
Well, anyway, Mike, I want to say I was really impressed when I came across the article of the storytelling. It woke me up. And looking through and through the LinkedIn site, you also have the piece on why your business needs a story library. And when I saw that, there was a small video. I took a look at that. That also intrigued me. So do you want to help our audience understand, first of all, what is a story library and why a company should have one?
Sure. Yeah, and I might just give you told my, let's say my formal biography, but for your listeners, you mentioned I trained as an engineer, and engineers often don't make good salespeople, let's put it that way. And, because we tend to be, quite analytical, and we like the facts, and we're maybe a little bit anti-story, but I got pushed into sales somewhat by accident. Well, really, I got offered a transfer to Norway back in 1996, and it was to a sales job, and I said, "Oh, I want to go to Norway, but I don't want to do sales." And my wife was eight months pregnant at the time, if you can believe it, with our second son. So we went to Norway, and she gave birth almost as soon as we got there. And that's how I got into sales, pretty much because I wanted to go to Norway. We both did.
Wow.
But I had this. There's nothing really special about my sales career, Tom, except for reasons of needing to live in different parts of the world and family circumstance, I changed industry. I not only changed countries, but I changed industry many times. And when you have to sell something, you join a company and you don't know the industry, and you maybe have like 6 months to show that you know what you're doing if you're lucky, and you better sell something.
Right.
And that was really when I hit upon storytelling. I realized that there are certain stories that I needed in order to sell. And, if you don't know the industry and you don't know your client and you don't know your products and services, that's pretty tough. But if you know certain stories, you can still succeed. And that's what I figured out. And I did that many times. And what I also realized, Tom, was that most companies don't prepare these stories for their salespeople,
right.
For their company. They don't, the story number one for a company is its company story that merges into its strategy story. So how did your company start? Why didn't it fail? Because most companies fail. And then how did it succeed? Did you have one special first customer, or, what was the circumstance that meant that your company started to succeed? What do you do now, and where are you going? And that's a story, because the story by definition is a sequence of related events. We started in this year, we're doing this thing, we nearly failed, we nearly went out of business, but we got this lucky break, and we got this new client, and we slowly built up our staff. Or maybe we had a really fast rise, whatever. But how do you tell that story so that it's interesting, and it also tells where your company's going? And as you probably noticed in that article I wrote, Tom, the reason we tell stories in sales is we want to be able to say, once we're told, let's say, our company story, we want to be able to say, well, what about your company? How did you guys get started? And then you start to hear the story of the other company. And this is, and same with your personal story. I told you a little bit about my personal story, but I would tell my personal story in a first meeting with a potential client, just in a couple of minutes, not too long. And then I would say, well, enough about me. What about you? How did you get how come you got into this company and into this role? And then you get this story exchange. And this is a beautiful thing. And this works everywhere in the world. Everywhere I've lived and worked, I've found that if you tell a story, the other person wants to tell a story back.
Right.
And it cuts through the formal way that we tend to behave in business meetings. We want to say what our job title is, and immediately get down to talking about facts about our company and our
get
business,
to the bottom line, right?
Yeah, those facts, unfortunately, are the same facts your competitors got, and your clients heard them all the time. And it doesn't really say what's special about you, or that you can be trusted, and that we can get along with each other. And that's the secret. So so the company story library should start with your company story, and then you've got to make sure that everyone knows how to tell that story. Not just your salespeople, but your customer service people and your, your implementation people, your project people. They need to be able to tell that story. And when I help my clients with that, we use video message. So we create a little video of the company story, typically 2 or 3 minutes long, and then we ask everyone to have a go at telling the story themselves. It doesn't have to be word for word, but send it in a video message, and then I check it and they get to practice it.
Right. And so that everybody's literally on the storyline, the same storyline.
Correct. Yeah, and what you find is if you don't do this work, if you assume that everyone knows the story, what you find is that they don't know the story. And I'll tell you a little story about that. I was working with the big electricity company here in Victoria, where I live, and we just completed working on their company story. Now, they'd been in business since 1918, so they had a long story.
Right.
And the head of business development that I was working with was hiring. And he thought, well, I'll just tell the company story to the candidates that were coming in.
Mm-hmm.
And he said it was just amazing. He said the candidates were so excited to work for their company, and this is like a boring power company. But they'd never heard.
Well,
they'd never
boring
heard
until the
tell
lights
their
go
company
out,
story.
right? Huh?
Correct, until the lights go out. Exactly. Then it's very interesting. So you can use your company story even in a job interview if you know it.
Right,
but most
right.
people, of course, don't know it. So the next story is, any company that's been in business for a while has success stories. You have clients,
Right.
you have customers that have succeeded with your products and services, and those stories need to be captured. And there's a format for capturing these. There's a structure.
Mm-hmm.
And in my book, 7 Stories that you mentioned, I explain the framework because I'm an engineer. I like to provide frameworks.
You like the nuts and bolts, right?
Yeah, that's right. Now, most people, when they think of success stories, they think of case studies. And case studies have 3 parts to them. Mm. And the 3 parts are, here's my poor client in this terrible situation, and here's my company running in to fix it for them. And then the third part is, and here's how great things are for them now. And there's a big problem with those 3 parts because it's all about our company.
Right.
And aren't we wonderful?
Right.
But that's not really a very interesting story for a future client.
Uh-huh.
So I teach a structure which is 6 parts. And it starts with, here is my other client in their situation. Here's how life is for them. They're like you. They're a similar company to yours. And now they hit a problem,
mm-hmm.
a challenge, and then they met us. Our company is the guide.
Mm-hmm.
And we work with them to formulate a plan. And this is what the plan was. And then we help them avoid failure.
Okay.
And then they succeeded. So that's 6 steps. And in the avoiding failure, you basically take them through the journey of how they didn't mess up and how they
Right.
did finally succeed.
Right.
And if you paint the picture that way,
and how actually they're part of the success. If you don't make them part of the success,
exactly.
There somebody thinks just
Exactly.
plug and play, bring somebody in, and they're gonna, they're the miracle worker, and it's really
That's
not
right.
that
You're
way.
making, yeah, that's right. You're making your successful client the hero of that story, and you're painting your company as the guide. Mm-hmm. And this is the correct way to structure a success story. Mm-hmm. And, big companies should have many, many success stories. The problem is those stories just sit in the minds of the best salespeople. They're not properly put in a place where people can share them and understand them. So that's why the story library, and my recommendation is to have your story library as a searchable index. Mm-hmm. And I'll send you, Tom, to put in your show notes our story library, so your listeners can have a look at our story library and they'll see how it works. So every story has an image to help people remember the story. It has a nice name. You try to think of a funny name for your story so that people can remember the name.
Right.
And then you have a 2 or 3 minute video of somebody telling the story. It might be the person, the sales guy that sold
mm-hmm.
the deal, or it might be your customer service person,
right.
or doesn't matter. Or it might even be your CEO telling the company story.
Right.
So then you've got the video, and then you tag it with some keywords, maybe the industry, the job role, things like that, so people can search and find it easily.
Right.
So now we've got company story and success stories. And then we move on to insight stories. So a lot of people don't understand what insight really is, so I'll define it for your listeners. Mm-hmm. Insight is something that your company knows about your client's market that they don't really properly appreciate, but they should. They should. It would really help them if they did. Now, the problem with insight, Tommy, is it can sound arrogant. Tom, I know something about your business you don't, and
right.
It's likely, if I just challenge you with this information that you might push back. But if I teach you in a story how we discovered that insight, you'll just listen to the story. And maybe I'll give you a short example, Tom.
Right.
This comes from Australia, this example, from the medical field. So back in the early 1980s, there were two medical researchers working in the Perth General Hospital, which is in Western Australia, Barry Marshall and Robin Warren. And Barry Marshall was actually a master's student, and Robin Warren was working on the problem of stomach ulcers. They had a hypothesis that stomach ulcers were caused by bacteria, not by stress, because in those days people used to think stomach ulcers were caused by stress.
Right.
And so they had this hypothesis, and they'd written about it, and they tried to do animal experiments, not very good ones, and nobody believed them. And Barry Marshall was a bit frustrated, and he had this idea. He performed an endoscopy on his stomach, on his own stomach, and then he created a potion from an infected patient, drank it, and then gave himself stomach ulcers. And then he took an antibacterium from this particular bacteria that they thought was the bacterium, and then showed that he had cured himself, right? Well, that paper got lots of attention, you know. When they wrote that paper, people took notice. And Marshall and Warren won the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 2004 because of that work on his stomach ulcers. But you see the structure. It's how do they discover that thing, and how do they get the message across? It's all in the story, you see. And they're creating that story of how to teach people that this thing really works. Yeah. And that's the insight story. That's the problem of insight. You know something, but nobody wants to believe you.
Right.
So you've got to teach them, you know, how you found out that thing.
Well, as I mentioned to our audience and to you even before, that when I saw your article and later the video presentation on the business library, it brought so much back to me in my professional life. For myself, I've been through a number of different companies and found the same thing that you said. You start working with a very large multinational company that, in my case, they invented aluminum hundreds of years ago.
Right.
And I expected everybody knew that. Everybody knows that because we invented it. The story was true. They invented aluminum. But here in Brazil, nobody knew that. So the fact of just saying we are the company that invented it, but going through the story, what was the success of that company was telling people how to use it.
How did it happen?
Invented it, what do you do with it? But the stories that I learned, because I'm not an engineer, I'm on the other side of the table from you. And the company that I worked with was full of engineers. It was an engineering manufacturing company. And so I had a different view. Right. So I had to develop let's say, the inside view from the outside. Because most of the customers were outside and didn't have the view. And so it was part of that storytelling. How could I get my story together? How could I understand the story? And that's the point that you made at the beginning. It took me some time to develop the story of the company, refit that in a way to tell the story. To tell a story that somebody who is not an engineer, who is not a user of the materials, could understand. And that did consume a lot of time. And what I got out of what I saw from what you just said is the reduction. To be a successful company today, and time is money, the faster you can get your salespeople up to speed, defining the story and then telling that story is essential today. Because many times a company doesn't even have the time to survive.
Yeah. And it's not just engineers. All companies are guilty of being way too into their own products and services and talking in jargon. And that's what stories cut through, because stories are just short, easy to listen to narratives that just cut through all of that jargon. And that's why they're so successful.
So keep it simple.
They work brilliantly. Exactly. And if you tell the story well, so I say there are 5 things that you must have in a business story. Firstly, it has to be a sequence of events, or it's not a story. This happened, and then because of that, this happened, and then this, and then this. If it's not a sequence of events, it's just not a story. End of it. It's not a story.
End of story.
And it won't be very interesting. End of story. And the next thing is, it needs a setting. You need to start with a time and a place. You know, in 1996, when I went to Norway, that tells you it's a true story. And it also tells you that I'm starting to tell a story. So people stop and pay attention. So you should start your story with a time and a place.
Mm-hmm.
And then we need a character. We need a central person in the story. So for your personal story, that's easy, or your company, it's your company or it's yourself.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're telling an insight story, it might be the researcher, the medical researcher in my example, or it might be your head of R&D is the character, the person.
Right.
And the reason we put a person in our story as the central character is we want the listener to imagine themselves as that character, because that's how you kind of live the story, right? So you want them to imagine that. And then we need something unpredictable, like it's a boring story if it's not unpredictable. So you probably didn't guess that Barry Marshall was going to drink, a stomach ulcer infection.
Right.
That's pretty unpredictable, right?
Right.
So now you're going, oh, what happened next, right? We want to know what happens next.
No.
So when our story is unpredictable, people pay attention and they're trying to predict what's going to happen next, right?
Right.
And that's what gives the story its interest. And that's point number 4. And the final point is your business story has to make a relevant business point. If you're telling a story to an important CEO or a CFO, they're going to kick you out if you're not making a relevant point. It's got to be the right story at the right time.
Something that they can equate with, something that really catches them at the end.
Well, that's right, and it's relevant to what you're talking about. They might say something about something they're concerned about with, let's say, a deal you're working on, and you say, look, that reminds me of, and then you start telling about another client in the same situation, and you teach them with that story, right? But it's got to be relevant to the situation. And when you do it like that, they won't even notice that you told a story. Stories are kind of invisible when you do them well. If you do it nice and tight, relevant, they just listen, they smile, and they nod, and they go, yeah, good. So it doesn't seem like you're
talking
wasting
business.
time.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Exactly. So those are the 5 critical points, and if you get them right, and I always, I recommend, some people are really natural at this, right? I think the very best salespeople they're natural storytellers, and maybe they don't even know they're doing it. But most people need to practice a little bit, internally practice their stories a bit before
that's with anything
tell
in
them
life, right?
Correct.
We learn to walk and we learn to talk because we practice. And to tell a story, any story, to your kids, right? You have to learn how to do that. And in a company, I agree with you. That was my wake-up call when I saw your information is sometimes we forget what the story even is. And you helped me wake up.
Big companies should have a story custodian. I mean, I call them a story leader, which is the name of our company. So someone that is good at facilitating storytelling sessions. So that means getting stories out of people in their company and out of your clients.
I want to make a point here. You're talking about big companies, but this last Monday, after I had seen your material, I sat down with a business person, an owner, small company, and he's been in business for 30-some years here in Campinas as a communication company. And he's the owner and the founder. And I mentioned that I was going to be interviewing you and what we were talking about. Talking to him about podcasting. I said, he's asking me, what do I get out of podcasting? I said, I learn a lot. First of all. But the other side, that I mentioned with you, and I used your story to him. I said, look, you've been in business for 34 years. What's your story? And where is it? And he got to that point that you made. He was just hiring a commercial person. And I asked him what you just said. How do they know your story? What are you doing? And he woke up to me. He said, wow, and explained a little bit what I had seen, pointed him to your site too. And he came to the same conclusion. That, I've been it, I made it, I've been here. And really somebody coming in literally yesterday to start. What do you tell them? Where do they find it? And he agreed. He says, they find their way, but could be faster.
Slowly. They
So
find their way
it's
slowly.
not just big companies. I think today with startups, your storytelling has to come down to the person who today, like myself, I'm the company. I'm the person. A startup today may be one or two people. So the story,
it's the same. Big, small, or startup.
I don't think it depends on size. So, but you have to have the story. You have to take the time to develop the story. I think
exactly so.
Well,
exactly.
I want to thank you.
So
You're coming. There are more stories to tell.
Could I tell one more story type?
Tell as many as you want. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, the final type that is my favorite type of story. I call them value stories. This is the story that explains to your future client how your company will behave if things go wrong. And what are you an ethical company? Can I trust you when things go wrong? Are you just going to put the price up after we sign the deal? What kind of company are you? And I'll give you an example. I worked for the big multinational company Siemens for quite a few years, and I happened to be in our country's CEO's office one day when he took a phone call, and when you can kind of tell when it's a serious phone call, right? His voice dropped, and you could tell that he was being very, very polite on the phone, and it was from our something was going wrong, right? I could tell something was not right. And he put the phone down and he said, Mike, that was from the Victorian government, and which is the state where I live in Australia. And we're supplying the electrical transformers for a huge multi-million-dollar project, which is a subsea electricity cable that goes from Tasmania, which is where I grew up in the south of Australia, to mainland Australia, 400 kilometers. And the ships that were bringing these massive pieces of equipment from Germany to Australia, it hit a storm in the Southern Ocean and broke its rudder, and it smashed all 6 of these transformers, right? And they took a year and a half to build.
Wow.
And he said, this is like the whole project was like at risk.
Right.
And he said to me, Mike, when I rang the Siemens chairman of the board, and they had an emergency board meeting in Germany, and they weren't discussing who do we litigate or, who's going to pay for these smashed transformers.
Right.
They were talking about how quickly can we make 6 more transformers, and they fast-tracked.
Right.
And actually the project hit its original delivery time. They didn't lose any time. They rebuilt 6 in record time, and the project was delivered on time. And that's an example of a value story. Like, how does your company behave when things go not to plan?
Right.
I love those kinds of stories. They're very persuasive. And
when they share and have value, that's it. And you got to get that story out, because I think
the
word trust, it's made from something.
But the funny thing, Tom, it doesn't work too well when I just say, trust me, right?
Oh, no. You have to show and tell why. Because everybody says, trust me, right? So I think that's the thing.
Yeah.
What story can you tell and how you can tell and who tells it? The people will believe that you're trustworthy. So
that's it. So your company story library should have your company story in it, which should include your strategy. It should have your success stories, your insight stories, your value stories, and even personal stories of the important people in your company. Like, I should be able to tell the story of my CEO or my CFO if they're coming to meet. I should know that properly as a background. But most companies only really prepare tiny little bios. They don't really prepare good, interesting stories about their people. So they should be in the story library as well.
And the CEO or business owner should also be able to tell the story of the incoming trainee.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. Whoever is needed, whoever your buyer needs to meet in the buying journey, you can prime them to really know and trust that person before they even meet them, just by being able to tell the other
person. I take that to the small business owner, because many times when you look at a small business and the small business owner, you're looking, you may not say that, but when you're looking to that person, you want the feeling of who's going to succeed you. If you're not here, who do I call? So
That's right.
that's part of the story as well, just to show that there's somebody or something coming along that will be there and protect the value.
That's right.
So.
And I often see salespeople who cannot break away from their past clients. So they're kind of heroically jumping in and being customer support instead of moving on to the next deal. And the reason is they haven't properly positioned the other people in their company by telling their stories. So they haven't passed on that trust to the other people because I call that the key staff story, the key person story. That's a really important story in business.
So it's a big library. You don't have just a bookshelf. You have a library.
You do not. You need a library. You need a library.
So, Mike, we're coming to the end of our time. I want to thank you for sharing all these stories. And I know you've made me, and I'm sure our listeners, start thinking about their own stories now. So thanks for being with us and part of Talk to Brazil.
Oh, it's fabulous. I'm delighted to be talking with Brazil.
Thank you, and the world, okay? And so what I do want to do is remind all of our listeners that you can find more about Mike Adams on LinkedIn, and also a site which is thestoryleader.com. So storyleader.com, you'll find more about Mike and more of the information. And let me just double check here, on LinkedIn you are M1KE Adams, right? So
that's right.
Because Mike Adams, there got to be several out there, right?
Correct. If your listeners put Mike Adams storytelling into Google, you'll get about 10 pages of me. So you'll easily find the book and everything.
Story leader, right? The bestsellers are storytellers. So if you want a story, listen to Mike, okay? So thanks to our audience. And I'd also like to invite our audience to check our website, which is talktobrazil.com, and find this and our previous shows of Talk to Brazil on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and TuneIn. And thank you for our audience, and remind everyone that today's program was brought to us by Focus MI Market Intelligence. And Focus MI specializes in market research for the Brazilian agricultural market. More about them on their site, which is focusmi.com. And always send your suggestions or comments to me at tom@talktobrazil.com, and join the Talk to Brazil group on LinkedIn and follow our discussions. So remember, when you talk to Tom, you talk to Brazil and the world. Goodbye, and thanks for listening. Thanks for listening to Tom Reaoch on Talk to Brazil, the business connector to Brazil.